The sun had barely risen over the muddy fields when the boy's father placed a hand on his shoulder. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was a gesture of finality. The boy was 7 years old, maybe 8. He did not know his exact age because no one had ever told him. Birthdays were not celebrated in the village. There were no candles, no songs, only seasons, only harvests, only the endless rhythm of labor that began before memory and would continue long after death. His father walked him down a narrow dirt path toward the manor house. The great stone structure loomed in the distance like a sleeping beast. Smoke curled from its chimneys. Banners hung limp in the morning stillness. Somewhere behind those walls lived the Lord, the man who owned the land, the man who owned the crops, the man who, by the laws of God and King, owned them. The boy did not understand what was about to happen. He only knew that his stomach ached with hunger, and his feet were cold in his worn leather shoes. He knew that his mother had cried the night before. He knew that his father had not spoken a single word since waking. They reached the gates. A steward emerged, a tall man with a thin face and ink-stained fingers. He looked at the boy the way a farmer looks at a new calf, measuring, assessing, calculating future worth. Papers were produced. The father made his mark, a crude X scratched onto parchment. And just like that, it was done. The boy now belonged to the manor. He would work the Lord's fields. He would grind the Lord's grain at the Lord's mill. He would bake his bread in the Lord's oven and pay a fee for the privilege. He could not leave the land without permission. He could not marry without permission. He could not learn a trade, join the church, or seek fortune in a distant town. His children would inherit his bondage, and their children after them. This was serfdom, and this is how it began for millions across medieval Europe. The system did not arrive with a single decree. It grew slowly, like rot spreading through timber. Its roots reached back to the collapse of the Roman Empire, when order crumbled and chaos reigned. Warlords carved up the land. Peasants, desperate for protection, traded their freedom for safety. They gave themselves to powerful men who promised to shield them from Vikings, from raiders, from the endless tides of violence that swept across the continent. It seemed like a fair bargain at first, but safety came with chains, and those chains grew heavier with each passing generation. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the feudal system had crystallized into something monstrous. At the top sat kings and emperors. Below them, great lords and dukes. Below them, lesser nobles and knights. And at the very bottom, pressed into the mud beneath the weight of the entire structure, were the serfs. They were not slaves. The church forbade the enslavement of Christians, but the distinction was subtle. Serfs could not be bought or sold as individuals, but they could be transferred with the land. If the Lord sold his manor, the serfs went with it, like cattle, like furniture, like any other possession fixed to the earth. They were bound, legally, spiritually, eternally, and the church sanctified it all. The priests told the serfs that their suffering was holy, that God had ordained the 3 orders of society, those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. The serfs were the workers, the hands that fed the world. Their labor was sacred, their obedience was divine. Rebellion was sin. To question the Lord was to question God himself. This message echoed from every pulpit, in every village, across every generation. It seeped into the bones of the peasantry. Many believed it. How could they not? The church was the only source of education, the only source of hope beyond the grave. Heaven awaited those who accepted their lot with humility. Hell awaited those who dared to resist. And so they endured. They woke before dawn. They worked until dark. They plowed and planted and harvested. They repaired fences. They dug ditches. They hauled stones to build the very castles that imprisoned them. 3 days each week belonged to the Lord. Sometimes more, having their own small plots, received only the scraps of their exhausted labor. When harvest came, the Lord took his share first. The church took its tithe second. What remained, if anything remained, was theirs. In good years, they survived. In bad years, they starved. A serf's home was a single-room hovel. Mud walls, thatched roof, a dirt floor shared with chickens and pigs because the animals' body heat helped ward off the winter cold. There was no chimney in most dwellings. Smoke from the cooking fire simply filled the room and escaped through gaps in the thatch. Eyes burned, lungs blackened. Respiratory diseases claimed the young and old alike. The diet was monotonous. Dark bread made from rye or barley, pottage, a thin stew of whatever vegetables could be scrounged, onions, cabbage, beans. Meat was rare, a luxury reserved for feast days, if even then. Protein came from eggs when the hens were laying, from milk when the cow had not gone dry. The malnutrition was constant. Stunted growth was common. A serf stood several inches shorter than his lord, not because of breeding, but because of hunger. Disease swept through the villages with brutal regularity. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox. The plague, when it came in 1347, would annihilate entire communities in weeks. But even before the Black Death, life expectancy hovered around 30 years. Many children did not survive infancy. Many mothers did not survive childbirth. And through it all, the labor continued, because it had to, because there was no alternative, because the fields demanded bodies, and the Lord demanded grain, and the system demanded obedience. There were small mercies. The Lord was obligated to provide protection. If raiders attacked, the serfs could flee to the castle. They could huddle behind stone walls while knights rode out to meet the threat. The Lord also administered justice, settling disputes between peasants, punishing thieves and murderers. But justice was a flexible concept. The Lord was judge, the Lord was jury, the Lord was executioner. If a serf offended him, punishment was swift and creative. Flogging was common. Mutilation was possible. A man who poached a deer from the Lord's forest might lose a hand. A woman who spoke ill of the Lord's wife might find herself locked in the pillory, pelted with rotten vegetables and stones. There was no appeal, no higher court. The Lord's word was final, and some lords were cruel. History does not remember their names, but the scars they left endured for generations. They beat their serfs for sport. They raped the women because they could. They starved the villages during harsh winters while their own tables groaned with food. Other lords were kinder. They understood that healthy serfs produced more grain, that contented villages caused fewer problems. But even the kindest lord was still a master, and even the gentlest cage is still a cage. The cruelest truth was this: the serfs internalized their bondage. They taught their children to bow. They taught them to kneel. They taught them that the Lord was superior by birth, by blood, by the will of God. Generations passed, and the memory of freedom faded. Grandfathers could not tell their grandsons what it meant to own oneself, because the grandfathers had never known it either. The chains became invisible, but they did not become lighter. The serf who dreamed of escape faced terrible odds. The roads were dangerous. Bandits prowled the forests. Other lords would not harbor him. Returning runaway serfs was a matter of feudal honor. If caught, the punishment was severe. Branding, hamstringing, sometimes death. And yet some did run. They fled to growing towns where a new rule was emerging. If a serf could live within the town walls for a year and a day without being claimed, he was free. The towns needed labor, and they welcomed the desperate. And so, slowly, the city of Vassal swelled with escaped peasants who had chosen uncertainty over bondage. But most could not run. Most had families, children, elderly parents who could not survive the journey. The ties of love held them tighter than any chain the Lord could forge. Centuries passed. The system endured. It endured through famines, through wars, and through the endless petty conflicts of noble houses that meant nothing to the peasants who bled and died in their fields. Then came the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague erased nearly half of Europe's population. Villages were emptied, fields went unplowed. The labor shortage that followed shifted the balance of power for the first time in generations. Surviving serfs could demand higher wages. They could bargain. They could, in some cases, walk away. The lords panicked. They passed laws freezing wages. They increased restrictions. They tried to tighten their grip. But the old order was cracking. Peasant revolts erupted across the continent. In England, the uprising of 1381 saw thousands of serfs march on London, demanding freedom. They were crushed. Their leaders were executed. But the seed had been planted. Serfdom would not die quickly. In Western Europe, it faded slowly across the 15th and 16th centuries, replaced by tenant farming and wage labor. In Eastern Europe, it persisted far longer, until 1861 in Russia, but eventually, finally, it ended. The boy who was brought to the manor at age 7 never saw that ending. He lived his life in the fields. He married a woman from a neighboring village, with the Lord's permission. He fathered children who inherited his status. He grew old before his time, his back bent, his hands calloused, his lungs scarred from decades of smoke-filled hovels. When he died, he was buried in the churchyard, in an unmarked grave. No stone recorded his name, no chronicle preserved his story. He was one of millions, anonymous, forgotten. But he was real. He breathed. He suffered. He loved. He dreamed. Somewhere, in the silence between the lines of history, his life mattered. He simply never belonged to himself, and he never knew what it meant to be free.